Hey there, it's David Bear from winebear.net, and today I have the great pleasure of chatting with Marnie Old. Marnie is one of the premier wine authorities in the U.S. She is a wine educator. She is a speaker. She is a published author of, I think it's 4 books, including one. Was it Kindle or iPad, or I can't remember.
It was iPad only. That was
Okay.
called a better book, but
Right.
they are iPads and iPhones only.
Got it. And you've been an educator, running the wine studies program at French Culinary Institute in Manhattan, and you got your start probably before this, but I know you from the Steven Starr restaurants, which are a major important restaurant group in Philadelphia, where you're based, and so I'm really excited to have you here. You were at one point one of my educators in my initial education.
That always makes me feel good when somebody enjoys it enough to stick around.
Well, absolutely. So welcome, and thank you so much for being a part of the discussion on wine confidence. This is part of a course that I've been putting together to help people who are sort of struggling with wine in general, whether it's the issue of trying to impress a date or trying to impress a client or a boss at dinner, whatever it may be, or just scared of that sommelier when they come over to the table and approach you, and what do you do? And so I know that at least one of your books, you've interviewed dozens and dozens of wine and culinary professionals and covered this very topic with some of them. So I hope we can dive into that, and I know that you have some other great tidbits to share as well, and so I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, to me, the question of wine confidence is actually really, you're hitting the nail on the head by addressing this particular topic, because I think it is the single most important issue for most wine drinkers. The reality is that almost every other product out there on the market is not as difficult to master as wine. It doesn't take much homework to feel like you're confident shopping for a car or for a new pair of shoes or for most food items. But wine has this terribly intimidating edifice of knowledge associated with it, and people have this feeling that if they don't recognize all the grapes and regions of the world, that they're somehow lacking, and it gives us this kind of sense of insecurity in all of our interactions with wine. And that is the first thing that we need to nip in the bud to help people understand that you don't need to have a deep lexicon of descriptive terminology or recognize every wine region in the world to be able to navigate with confidence.
I think that's absolutely true, and I in researching where all of this came from, I think that a lot of the way that we fear wine came from the. I actually look back to like the World Fair when there was Le Pavillon or something like that, and there was the first introduction of the snooty sommelier that entered into the American culture. And we were introduced to this gatekeeper of this, precious wine stash that these restaurants had, and it was a product that most Americans didn't know very well at that point. So, and we've sort of stuck with that, even though time and accessibility and all of that has changed so much when it comes to wine.
Well, I actually think it goes one step further than that. I think you're right that the intermediary, the middleman piece of the wine transaction is one of the things that takes it outside of the comfort zone for most American consumers. However, I think that there's something about wine inherently that requires a middleman. If you think about the way wines are labeled and sold, with formal appellations telling you where the grapes are grown, being a region statement on the label, and many of them also carrying one additional piece of information, the name of a grape variety that they're made from. The fact that the stickers on the bottles give you information that means nothing to most people requires a middleman. It's not a product designed for self-serve shopping. And when we think back to the history of wine, the way it was originally produced and sold was that casks would go out to wine merchants who would actually bottle the product on the premises for their guests there. What's interesting is that we left behind this model where the wine merchant is the intermediary, where you would walk in and literally tell them, I'm looking for a wine to celebrate the birth of my first son. I want it to last 20 or 30 years so he can enjoy it when he's an adult. Those kinds of questions were traditionally interpreted by a professional, and that professional was the person who knew there are certain wines that fit that bill. It could be Bordeaux, it could be port wines from Portugal, and so on. And so these are the types of wines I'm going to recommend for your need as the consumer. Once we take wine and put it into the grocery store model, where the customer is walking around the aisles and forced to look at those labels themselves and interpret and figure out what's inside the bottle, that's where we start getting into trouble, because, of course, so many other products can be judged more easily. Like, you don't have to know a lot about tailoring to be able to reach out and feel the difference between silk and wool, right? Mm-hmm. But with wine, the product itself is hidden inside the bottle. People don't get a chance to sample it, and so they're kind of stuck in limbo, trying to figure out from the information on the sticker alone what it is they're looking at, what that experience is going to be like. And in the wine business, we've done a really terrible job of helping people through this problem, because the labels don't tell you if the wine is light or heavy or sweet or dry or young or mature or oaky or not. We don't give a lot of sensory information on wine labels. So, of course, our customers are going to feel confused and in the dark.
Okay, so you've painted a pretty bleak picture here, and I know that our intent is to actually solve this problem for people.
Yes.
And I one of the things that you've done in your career thus far, you haven't just worked in the restaurant world. You actually were working in the retail world in Pennsylvania, the state where you are. Those are all state-controlled stores, and I think you. Correct. You played a role as a wine advisor or something. I don't even remember what your role was.
I did, and I was in charge particularly of one retail experiment that they ran here in Philadelphia, which focused on a small boutique selection of imported wines. It was a very unique store within the Pennsylvania system, but it got me a great introduction to retailer concerns, believe me.
But I think that probably that experience, particularly because you were dealing with imported wines, really addressed a lot of the issues that you just talked about in terms of our inability to easily interpret what is
Yes.
in those bottles.
Well, many of our problems in the wine world are what I think of as forest and trees issues. We have a tendency to want to get real up close to the detail of the wines, and so people, when they first encounter a wine list in a restaurant or an array in a retail store, they have this feeling that they're supposed to recognize everything, that they're supposed to know what all these things mean, that they should know for certain which grape variety is going to taste lighter or heavier and so on, and also that they should be able to interpret vintages. They should know which ones are the good ones and the bad ones. And of course, this is all complete nonsense. The reality is, even wine experts like ourselves, when we walk into a new restaurant or into a new retail store, chances are we only recognize somewhere between 20 and 50% of the offerings, and many of those wines are new to us in the same way that they're new to the average consumer. This is in part because the wine world is so fractionalized, and most of wine communication and most wine education is actually sponsored. It's really sales-driven at the end of the day. So most people are learning about wine in a tasting room at a winery, or in a retail shop where they're being offered tastes of something that's available for sale, or even in a restaurant environment. The sommelier is, of course, wanting to share wine knowledge, but it's a sales transaction at the end of the day. So what ends up happening is that we focus very much on wine-specific details, where what most beginners need to really get a handle on the wine world is actually to back away from the labels, step away from the vintage charts and so on, and to get a sense of how the wine world works as a whole. Once we realize that it's much more important to understand what to expect from a Sonoma Chardonnay as opposed to a French Chardonnay than it is to know what this brand tastes like next to this one. Once we understand that we should really be stepping back and looking at the forest and not the individual trees, it gets much easier to navigate and to sort of get a sense of your preferences, to get confident enough to describe and ask for and recognize when you receive a product that fits your expectations and your desires. Now, in the world of retail, that's a challenge, right?
I guess because you're not really getting inside the bottles there, and you're not it's not the experience, at that very moment. It's
Of course.
you're anticipating what that experience is going to be like after you bring that bottle home or wherever you're bringing it.
And what I often recommend people do at that very beginning stage where they're just paralyzed by the array of options on a retail shelf is that they start with really fundamental, basic stuff and not worry themselves too much about the finer shades of nuance. First off, people need to decide what they want to spend on a bottle of wine before they start, because if they don't, it can get very confusing, and you start getting into these socially awkward questions of, well, do I have to spend $5 more to get a decent bottle of wine? The reality is, in the modern era, wine is better now than it ever has been, and by that, I'm including the cheap and cheerful wines that a French winemaker friend of mine calls glou 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 wines, right? Even those wines are better now than they have been for centuries, and there is always going to be a place for superior products and special occasions. And you know what? We also need wine for those backyard occasions where we're eating things with our hands, like burgers and barbecues too. Mm-hmm. So first off, walking into the store with a good idea of what you want to spend, whether that's $10 to $15 or $25 to $30, really takes away some of the stress. And there is, of course, a difference in the quality range. When you step back and look at the big picture, we do get more craftsmanship, more integrity of product, a kind of structural integrity almost, when we move up the price scale in wines. And it tends to give wines that cost more a longer finish, more resonance in the mouth after you take each sip. And it also tends to help them improve over time and resist oxidation, so they don't spoil quite as quickly. But for the budget-minded, there's really no reason not to indulge in the cheap and cheerful everyday stuff in the backyard every now and then too. You have to think about your occasion. So first off, decide on price. That's a number, and that's something you should be familiar enough with to feel comfortable with. In my market here in Pennsylvania, you can get darn decent wines in that $10 to $15 category, and there's really no need to spend more than that if it's outside of your budget range. If you are able to spend more and not break the bank, decide where your comfort zone ends, right?
Yep.
Now, the second thing that I always tell people...
Question about price quickly, Marnie, I'm sorry. One of the things that a lot of people are concerned with is that price and quality have some relationship with each other. And that's actually a section in the course that I cover where I talk about the fact that there are just as many bad wines at high prices as there are bad wines at low prices. What's your take on this entire sort of area?
Well, I think that that's accurate, but I also think that it's, from the consumer's perspective, it's more important to zero in on your personal taste preferences than it is to worry about ups and downs of quality at this entry-level stage. There's going to become a point as you enjoy more and more wines that you start to realize, wow, I really find myself going back to the ones that are more refreshing. The lighter, brighter wines really push all my buttons. Or maybe you're a person who feels like you really want as much explosive flavor in every sip as possible, and those wines that have a little bit more power or more your style. Figuring this out is far more important than worrying about whether each individual bottle you buy is going to be a good bet or a bad bet. Is it a good year or a bad year? Honestly, stressing about those things is really not terribly productive. The reality is that we have a globalized wine market now, and it's a buyer's market. We have so much more power now as the wine buyer than at any previous point in history. It's not worth worrying about encountering wines that are incorrectly made, because they get pushed out of the marketplace. We just don't see them. And if we do, we can usually suspect that that's what they are, because they've been downgraded to that $5 bargain bin in the corner. And those are the wines that aren't perhaps able to command the price that they were released at. We tend to recognize that pattern, whether it's in wine, in shoes, in sweaters, in everything else that we buy. Things that don't quite make the grade are the ones that are often discounted first in highest volume. And generally, the retailer has an interest in bringing that price down to the point where it's no longer a bad buy. There are wines that would be a disappointment at $25 that are a thrill at $15, if you get my meaning.
I would say that buyer's market point is probably accurate for North America, maybe UK, and some other markets, but it's not all over the world. I mean, clearly, a lot of the major wine-producing countries in Europe, for example, you don't find wines from outside of those countries, and certainly not within those given regions. That's not necessarily the point of this conversation. I think we find that's here in the U.S. we're really, really fortunate as wine consumers, I guess is the point I'm making.
Right, and I think that there is more. The European markets have also changed more towards our situation than they have. They're not going in the other direction. Mm-hmm. The reality is that we are moving closer and closer towards a truly globalized market with every decade that passes.
Okay. So you had started with price, and then I think there were a couple of other areas that I think you want to focus on.
Well, and I do think that people eventually, as they drink more wine, start becoming more familiar with region names like California or Burgundy, or with grape names like Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. But even if you don't want to keep those in your brain, even if you can't remember which one is Pinot Gris, white or red, is Pinot Noir the red one, I can't remember. Even if you can't recall that information, there are a few numbers when you're wine shopping that can give you a tremendous amount of information just reading between the lines. So the selling price is one of them, certainly. We just talked a little bit about what to expect when you move up and down that price scale. But there are also two other numbers that you'll find on most wine labels. One is alcohol content, which is pretty much required by law in most wine regions of the world. And the other is vintage date. Not all wines carry a vintage date, but certainly the premium ones generally do. And we tend to look right past those numbers, not really thinking of them as key pieces of information. But I have to tell you, if I could only pick one piece of information to go by in deciding on what to drink, it's alcohol content is the one that I would pick before grape, before region, because it tells you so much about what to expect from the style of the wine. And this sounds crazy because the range of alcohol content for wines is relatively small. The vast majority of them are between 12 and 15% alcohol. There are some outliers a little bit below in the white wine range. There's some outliers a little bit higher in the white wine and fortified range. But the vast majority of what we think of when we're wine shopping falls in that sort of 12 to 15 range. Now, it sounds like a half a degree of alcohol should really not make much of a difference to the flavor of the wine, but it does. And it does in two ways. One is that alcohol content itself is a characteristic that we can feel in the mouth. Not so much a taste, but really more of a textural richness. And the higher the alcohol content is in the wine, the richer and heavier it will feel in the mouth. The lower the alcohol content in the wine, the more brisk, more refreshing, more sheer and delicate the wine will feel. And this is, in many ways, the single most important criteria for deciding what to drink with what we eat, because, for example, the richer, heavier wines are the ones that really need those richer foods that have higher fat content, whereas the lighter, brighter wines are the ones that better suit those, more diet-friendly, low-fat foods. Mm-hmm. But it's also one of the primary things that makes us that we develop a personal affinity for. People sometimes like to play the field and try all sorts of styles, but most people have a favorite somewhere in there. And the best thing to do is to think of 13.5% alcohol as being roughly the modern norm, and that the lower a wine is below 13.5%, the more likely you are to find characteristics of refreshment. And that's not just the higher level of acidity and tanginess that we associate with cool climate wines and white wines. It also goes through into lower sort of flavor intensity per square inch. We tend to get milder flavors when we go into lower alcohol content, simply because grapes ripen at a predictable pace, and alcohol content is a direct reflection of the degree of sugar content that occurs in the grapes. So when we pick the grape...
Marnie, of what a milder versus a bolder flavor might be, so that our audience can understand that terminology?
Well, sure. I pulled up a couple bottles with me to give a bit of an illustration of what I'm talking about here. I chose a grape variety that I had two of in my fridge. So I have two Chardonnays here, and one of them comes from France, and one of them comes from California. And these two bottles, when you look at them on the shelf, you might not really know what to expect about their difference in flavor. But if you look at the small print, you can find the alcohol content on the French wine is 13%, and the alcohol on the California wine is, there it is in small 13.9. Now that's almost a full degree of alcoholic difference, and that's actually a pretty big jump in the world of wine. What I can figure out from that is that this wine, the lower alcohol content, is likely to be more delicate and understated flavor-wise in the sense of sort of the bite of a fresh pear or a fresh apple off the tree. Whereas when we get to the higher alcohol content, nearly 14% here in California, chances are the flavors developed further along with the sugar content in the grapes in order to project a little bit more intensity of flavor. It might still taste like it falls in the apple pear range, but more in that concentration of flavor that you get with desserts like apple pie as compared to a fresh apple. It's a little bit more intensity of flavor. It's that kind of shift. Think about it this way. If you have ever grown tomatoes in your backyard, you know that you can pick the tomatoes while they're still green and eat them. They just don't quite taste like tomatoes yet. They're not sweet yet. They don't taste tomatoey. They haven't turned red. I always, when I have the fried green tomato sandwich myself, I always think of the flavor as being a little bit more like, I don't know, like celery or broccoli. It has a kind of leafy green flavor, more like salad and less like tomatoes, right? As tomatoes ripen, the exact same thing happens in grapes, in the vineyard, of course, but as they ripen, they get sweeter, they get more flavorful, they get to their final color, and they drop in acidity and lose that leafy green chlorophyll-y flavor that we associate with green underripe fruit. So if we think of the progression of flavor from the underripe green tomato to the ripe red tomato, that's kind of similar to the flavor shift that we see here between the understated underripe Chardonnay from France and the fully ripe Chardonnay from California. And the way this works is so consistent. It's actually it's a useful metaphor to bear in mind, because we don't have to just stop at the red tomato. If you let your cherry tomatoes hang out in the garden too long and don't pick them, they start to turn into sun-dried tomatoes on their own. They start to shrivel and lose water content. They get sweeter, more concentrated, and their flavors move away from refreshing freshness to that depth and almost spicy complexity that you get with more exposure to the sun. There are wine styles out there, mostly red wines, but there are styles out there that approach that sun-dried tomato level of intensity as well, and those characteristics can be associated with higher alcohol contents in the wine. Now, there is one exception to this rule. The alcohol content is an excellent reflection of ripeness as long as the wine is fermented dry, meaning that all of the grape sugar from the fresh fruit has been allowed to convert into alcohol during the winemaking process. And the vast majority of wines are made dry, so that's not really a major issue. It covers almost all of the most popular styles. But when you see wines whose alcohol content is under 12%, you can almost always be certain that the winemaker stopped fermentation early and kept a little bit of sweetness in the wine. Very low alcohol content suggests a sweet style, and the lower the alcohol content in general, the sweeter the wine ends up being.
I always tell people that German wine labels are incredibly confusing for most people, but actually they're the most helpful for me, because I know exactly what I'm going to find inside the bottle as a result of seeing, 7% alcohol and all of the place information and so much more. So I understand totally what you mean.
Exactly. And so this ends up being sort of, think of it as a style spectrum, from cooler climate, lighter, brighter, to warmer climate, denser, richer, bolder flavors. This is a broad enough pattern in the wine business that when we compare wines that have different alcohol content, we can pretty much guess. When we're looking at two Chiantis and trying to decide between the two, for example, often the lower alcohol content will be a more traditional style. The higher alcohol content might be more trying to appeal to an American market, perhaps making it a vineyard using a more modern winemaking approach, letting the grapes hang longer on the vine, for example, to achieve more ripeness.
So in this example, it's not important necessarily for us to know what those two styles mean, like the examples you've just given, but more importantly, how we personally respond to them.
Absolutely. And once we know whether we're really shooting for refreshment or richness, whether we're, preferring something mild and understated to go with our, maybe we're serving something delicate like fresh mozzarella salad, understatement is a positive in that circumstance, and we might want to err towards lower alcohol content. Whereas the bolder the food is, the more intensity we crave as our personal preference, the more looking at higher alcohol contents can really help us find the styles that we're going to enjoy most, regardless of grape variety, regardless of region of origin, regardless of white or red. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Hey, we are eating into the time that I've allotted, and I wanted to make sure that
Okay.
we cover.
Sure.
You wanted to talk a little bit about vintage, and then I'd love to
Absolutely.
get some tips from you on the experience that people have in a restaurant and how to sort of work through the process of the whole wine shtick, right? And
Absolutely.
how they deal with those. So if there's any great pointers either that you've covered in your previous book, Wine Secrets, I'd love to pick up on that stuff, or any just helpful hints that you have as well. So
Oh,
let's
of
talk
course.
about vintage first.
Well, vintage is actually a very simple one, and we can get through that one fairly quickly. Wine is a product that is aged more than all other agricultural goods that we eat. The one exception is something like cheese, for example, where you might be able to have a young cheddar next to an aged cheddar, or a young Gouda next to an aged Gouda. And we do, in that instance, encounter an intensification of flavor and a change of flavor that happens with aging that is kind of similar to what takes place in wine. Wines don't necessarily get stronger in flavor, but their flavors shift as they mature. So when I encourage people to look at those three numbers when they're shopping: price, alcohol content, and vintage, it's not that I expect them to remember what was a good vintage year in northern Italy. I am encouraging them to look at what are the youngest wines and what are the oldest wines on the shelf. Because within any given section, let's say you've narrowed it down to California Chardonnay, like the wines that we have here, or to Spanish Rioja or something in that category. When you look at wines that are sitting on the shelf, check their vintage date. The older the wine is, the more likely it is, not required, but the more likely it is to have been made in a heavier style designed for long-term aging. One of the reasons that a wine might be older on the shelf is that it was held longer at the winery. And almost always, not every region, but most regions that do that, keep the wines in barrels first before they move them to bottle aging. And the longer a wine spends in oak, in that woody environment that we use for aging things like whiskey and cognac, for example, the more it picks up some of those toasty, nutty, almost caramelized qualities of flavor that we associate with those spirits. So when we look at two Chardonnays from California on the shelf, for example, so many of them these days are unoaked that it's very common. I could be walking into a store and looking at the 2013s this year in 2014. So it spent 1 year being made, and now it's out in the marketplace 1 year old. Mm-hmm. Wines that are released that quickly are almost always going to be more vibrant, more fresh, more fruit salad flavors, and less the kind of caramelized flavors that we get with either drying, cooking, or aging fruit, right? Yep. Whereas the older the wine is, if we're looking at a competing Chardonnay on the shelf that's 2 years older, maybe a 2011, it's much more likely that that wine spent some time in barrels and then was rested again even longer in bottles before it was sent out to the market. Now, the question I always get is, how can you be sure that it hasn't just been sitting on the shelf for 2 years? Well, the reality is that the profit margins have gotten much, much thinner in the wine business, and globalization has had this impact on everyone, from the wineries to the distributors to the retailers and restaurateurs and consumers. It's very rare for a product that you see in a store to have been purchased more than a year ago. In fact, chances are it came out sometime in the last 3 to 6 months.
Yeah. And you can just always see how much dust is on the bottle, too.
Yes, that does help.
Yeah.
Well, but you had a question about restaurants, and I have to say, one of the most freeing ideas I find for most people when they're feeling uncomfortable making a decision about wine in a restaurant, it's almost always to do with food. Like, I'm eating sushi, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with raw fish, or I am in the steakhouse and I know Cabernet goes with steak, but they're all out of my price range. What else can I choose? That kind of thing. And I have to tell you, I think much more important than the old standby rule of thumb about white with fish and red with meat, there's a more important consideration with wine and food pairing that can really help get people past some of that stress, and that's simply to understand the deep connection between wine and food. It's much deeper than for cocktails or beer or anything else that we drink. Trust me, for thousands of years, wine has been made historically not to be evaluated by itself. This era of blind tastings in brown paper bags is very much a new development, okay? Historically, wines were designed to be flattering food partners. It's almost better to think of it as sauce on the side, right? Mm-hmm. So this wine was designed by the people in this region that have been producing it for hundreds of years to be flattering to the kinds of things that they eat all the time in that region. Now, What's interesting is that how the wine and the food will interact is not so much based on the type of protein, like whether it's a vegetarian dish or a meat dish or a fish dish or a pasta dish is not quite so important as the seasoning and how the dish is prepared. And this is such an unfamiliar idea to many people, but there's a simple little demonstration you can do at any bar, in any restaurant. You can do it at home with your friends in your kitchen, and I'm going to show you how it works so you can share it with your friends. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so the only thing that needs to happen is that the wine needs to be a dry wine. We don't want to try this with a sweet port like a dessert wine. We don't want to do it with a German Riesling or a Moscato, for example, that has overt sweetness, because that does kind of mess it up. And the other thing is we want to stay away from wines with bubbles. So we want to pick a still dry wine. It could be white, it could be red, doesn't matter what grape variety, but we're going to illustrate something about how our senses operate, how our tongue and our sense of smell and touch interpret flavors that really helps us feel more comfortable putting wine and food together. So the way this works is first you taste a sip of the wine by itself to see how you respond to it, whether you like it or dislike it on its own. And for me, this Chardonnay is lovely, but it's a little tart. It's got quite a little acidic edge to it that if I were drinking it alone at a party, it might be a little rough. It's something that to me is a food wine. It needs to have that food to offset it. And for most wine drinkers, they aren't really sure what those of us in the business mean by that. And there's one quick way to explain it, and that is to take a pinch of salt. It's almost like we're doing a shot of tequila here, David. You got the salt on your tongue, let the crystals dissolve, and then go back and take a second sip of the same wine right away. And what becomes apparent is that the wine is in many ways designed for a salty environment. Salt blocks the receptors on your tongue that perceive the wine's acidity. So when you put salty food in the same environment as an acidic beverage like wine, the wine softens the perceived saltiness of the food, and the salt in the food softens the acidity of the wine. The two together taste better than they did apart. They have a saying in France when they're training sommeliers. They say, sell on an apple, buy on an apple, sell on cheese. Yep. The idea is that if you want to sell the wine, make it seem as beautiful as possible, put it in a salty context with something like cheese that has lots of sodium to offset the edge, the acidity of the wine. Mm-hmm. But if you want to show it in a negative light, if you really want to throw this wine out of whack and make it taste like toothpaste and orange juice, there's a way to do that too. And that is, you can do it with sugar, but I prefer to do it with honey. I use these little honey pixie sticks in my classes, so I always have tons of them lying around the office.
Those would be dangerous in my house with my daughter, but that's great.
Mm-hmm. So if you just get a little dab of sweetness on your tongue this time instead of the salt, and go back again right away to the same wine, it is really dramatically clear that the wine is happier with the salt than it is with the sugar. At the end of the day, saltiness in food is wine's best friend for dry wines, whereas sugar is its worst enemy because it amplifies the perception of sourness, and that really throws the whole thing out of balance. What's interesting about this, and the reason that it's so important for people to do and kind of internalize, is that there are cuisines that rely more heavily on sugar and cuisines that use almost no sugar. I mean, if you think about the classic continental cuisines like French cuisine, Italian cuisine, the Spanish and the Germans, almost everyone in Europe, in regions where wine was likely to be at the dinner table, in those regions, it's very uncommon to use lots of sugar in the food, except at breakfast and dessert when you're drinking coffee. Why? Because it makes your wine taste funny. It really leaves it askew, not really tasting as good as it should. I used to teach at the French Culinary Institute, and trust me, there are 3 things that you can add to almost any recipe, no matter what it is, fish or meat, breakfast, lunch, dinner. Salt, fat, and sugar are the 3 things that you can put in almost anything in a small amount and improve its impact and make it seem yummier, right? But what's interesting is in Europe, where wine was commonly drunk, they relied most heavily on salt and fat because it was so wine-friendly, and left the sugar only for those breakfast and dessert occasions where wine wasn't going to be thrown under the bus. But the minute you leave the classic cuisines of Europe, the minute you get into Asian cuisine, the minute you get into the Americas with what we do here with soul food, for example, think about what's on the Thanksgiving table where we slather everything with a honey glaze and a cranberry sauce and sprinkle mini marshmallows on the sweet potatoes as if they weren't sweet enough with all that brown sugar. Outside of classic European cuisines, we use salt, we use fat, and we use sugar at the same time. And this can be a challenge for the driest wines. Generally, I don't worry so much about putting white with seafood and red with meat. I'm much more in tune with the sauces and the preparations. For me, when something is high in sugar in terms of the sauce, a barbecue sauce or a teriyaki or something along those lines, mango salsa, I'm much more likely to pick either a New World wine or a wine that has overt sweetness, like a German Riesling that we were talking about earlier. Whereas the less sweet a dish is, the more it focuses simply on those salt and fat flavors, the more I know I can have that whole range of dry wines, especially those drier European styles, available for pairing. And then, honestly, foods that are not cooked, things like salads and sashimi and ceviche, those kinds of things that we eat without any real intervention from application of heat, tend to taste best with wines that are quite young and unoaked. The younger the wine, the fresher the foods should be to go with them. That's where you start getting into a lovely interplay of sort of vibrancy between both dishes. And for me, the more oak and age a wine has seen, the more I want to put it with foods that have been cooked and where you can taste the effects of that browning or caramelization in the cooking process in the way that it changes the flavor of the food. It tends to have a beautiful synergy with the way the wines have changed in the periods of aging and maturation in the cellar.
Okay. Well, these are some terrific shortcuts, and I think it is very much the way that people think about what they ought to be drinking when they go to a restaurant. And I think the way that you positioned it initially before you went through this exercise, which, by the way, I think we did at Friendly, and one other thing on the plate that we went through in that exercise with you years ago. I don't even remember how many years ago that was. But you started by saying people sit down and they think about what they're going to eat, and then they think, well, what am I supposed to have with this? And I think you've just illustrated, the general overview, the forest, right, of what is going to work best. Ultimately, people can do whatever they want.
Of course.
And that's probably the bottom line.
I just did a seminar on this recently at the Aspen Food and Wine Classic in June, which was called What Not to Pair. And the entire point was that it's very terrifying to think that in all the world of wines and all the world of foods, you have to somehow pick out the two things that match, that go together. This isn't really how it works. As a sommelier, I am almost never thinking, oh, that has pesto, and pesto goes with white Bordeaux, and I'm going to put those two things together, right? Usually what I'm doing is I'm trying to rule out the clashes, the food chemistry-based wine and food combinations that are going to create a really basic lack of harmony, so that I can then have a range of options that might be suitable for the individual that I'm speaking to, recommending wines for. So when I talk to you in a restaurant, I'm not just going to pick a wine based on which entree you chose on the menu. I'm going to ask you what your preferences are, so that I can have a sense of context, whether you're a white wine person or a red wine person or an imported European wine person or a New World, kind of jam it up kind of person, right? That piece of information is essential as well, because at the end of the day, there are many roads to positive, flattering pairings, but there simply are some combinations, like the toothpaste and orange juice of sugar in the sauce with dry wines, that are almost universally unpleasant. It's kind of like this. Think of it this way. Within genres of music, right? Like maybe I'm a bluegrass person, and I don't know, maybe you're into dubstep, right?
I don't even know what that is.
Neither of us... Okay, well, I don't know, techno dance music, how's that? But the one thing that is universally deemed unpleasant is people singing out of key or atonal music or the lack of rhythm. Those things in music are very, very unpleasant for most human ears to listen to. So regardless of what our preference is in style, we're almost always going to want to avoid people singing out of key, right?
Yeah.
Well, to me, It's the exact same thing in putting wine and food together. I don't know who my customer is until I've had a chance to talk to them in terms of figuring out what they like and don't like. But I sure want to steer them away from the edge of the precipice and take away the wine options out of the possible candidates that might either be really just downright unpleasant, unflattering to either the wine or the food. There's just no point in that. They're out to have a good time. They want everything to taste good together. We can certainly rule out the issues that are fundamentally unsound, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, this is a gem. This is one of those things. I've probably not heard this idea positioned this way, but it's something that I practice all the time, which is,
of course,
I'll look at a menu and I'll look at the wine list and I'll say, well, I really want to drink that, but that's just going to ruin this meal. And I think that's probably
reverse engineering.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I think it's one of the biggest takeaways that I think anybody who's watching this conversation should have, which is let's figure out what's not going to work and then think about all the things that we want to enjoy with our meal and then just choose from them.
Exactly.
Well, that's great. Hey, I have kept you far longer than I had promised, and I really appreciate your time. You've given us such great insight. I'd love if you would take just a quick moment and share with our viewers where they can find out more about you.
Oh, sure, absolutely. First of all, that would be marnieold.com, and my name is MarnieOld. And at that website, you'll find all sorts of information about the stuff I do. And I just realized I should have had this handy, but if you hang on one second.
Sure.
The two books that I have out that are most appropriate to this confidence conversation, one you mentioned came out a few years ago. It's called Wine Secrets, and people can find this on Amazon or anywhere they buy books. Cool. But I also have a new one out that I don't think you've seen yet, David, and it is called Wine, a Tasting Course, and it's from DK. You might know them because they specialize in illustrated guides to almost everything.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, it took me about 10 years to find a publisher who was willing to let me do full-color artwork on every page and infographics and charts, not photos. It is really designed for people at exactly the stage you're speaking to with this video, looking to develop a little bit of wine confidence. You'll have to check it out. It's called Wine, a Tasting Course, and it just came out in January.
Well, great. We'll leave a link to that as well under this video when we post it, so people can check that out as well. So. Hey, I really appreciate you taking so much time to chat with us, to educate our audience, and to give them further insight, and look forward to getting back to the East Coast at some point and encountering you in person again. So thanks
Absolutely.
so much.
You'll have to look me up when you're in Philly or New York. I end up doing a fair amount of work up there as well.
Well, terrific. Hey, Marnie Old, thank you for joining us, and I really appreciate your time and your insight, and we hope to see you soon again.
Glad to help.
Thanks.